It's been 11 years since Zack Snyder's Man of Steel was released in theaters. And to this day, we still have trolls on the internet and people in the media completely missing the point and misinterpreting what this movie was actually about. If someone were to ask me where the origins of my feelings that film criticism is dead began, I would say it would be around the time that Man of Steel was released. It's a level of media illiteracy, the likes of which that we've never seen before and may never see again. Let's discuss.
I watch so you don't have to.
All I'm offering is the truth, nothing more.
Do you know how I know that a lot of the criticisms that were directed at Zack Snyder's DCEU were based on a personal bias against the director himself and not necessarily what we see on screen? I know this because we currently find ourselves in a time where the DCEU is officially dead, and everyone has seemingly moved on, even the studio. So basically, DC on Film's biggest critics got exactly what they wanted. Yet they continue to put out hit pieces in the media looking for people to blame for the demise of the DCEU. And unsurprisingly, they point the finger at everyone except the people they should be pointing the finger at, that being the studio, Warner Brothers.
You're pathetically predictable.
This is what the media does. They build false narratives, and they get so entrenched in that narrative that even when they are proven to be completely wrong, they have no choice but to double down as a way to try to save face. Little do they realize, most normal people don't take anything they hear on these platforms seriously anyway, because they've already proven themselves to be biased and completely unreliable when it comes to reporting news on entertainment. The reality is, journalism is just as dead as film criticism. So now, just a few weeks after the final official DCEU film was released and flopped, Screen Rant, of all places, is once again shifting the focus and trying to point everyone's attention in the misinformed direction that they choose. And not only are they blaming Zack Snyder, still, for the DCEU failing. Mind you, Zack hasn't really been affiliated with the DC brand since 2017.
It's true.
But Screen Rant also took the opportunity to place blame at the feet of one Christopher Nolan and his guidance. That's right, they are blaming the man who is responsible for the Dark Knight trilogy, and the man who could and should win the Oscar this year for Best Director for the demise of the DCEU. Please somebody make it make sense. I haven't seen this much deflection since I fired up NBA Street back in 2002. Screen Rant just today released an article titled "Christopher Nolan's Help with the Man of Steel set up Zack Snyder's DCEU to fail." What the title should read is that Warner Brothers' lack of patience set up Zack Snyder's DCEU to fail, but I digress. So this article talks about Christopher Nolan basically single-handedly resurrecting the superhero genre with Batman Begins. Probably the one accurate thing written in this entire piece. It is a fact that every single superhero movie we have today, for better or for worse, would not exist without the success of Christopher Nolan's Dark Knight trilogy. Because this genre was an absolute joke prior to those films existing. Nolan basically showed everyone that superheroes could and should be taken seriously again. And to be clear, those are my words, not the words used in this article. The article predictably goes with the dark, gritty, and grounded description of Nolan's films. But in my eyes, as much as people try to describe them as being just that, that doesn't tell the whole story. That's just something people say when they have absolutely nothing else to contribute to the conversation.
Because it's all part of the plan.
Bottom line, Nolan's trilogy worked more than anything because it took the characters seriously. That involves hiring the right people for the job to bring this vision to life. And I will say this, after those films came out, every studio was looking for their Dark Knight. Everyone wanted to try to replicate that success. And most people failed because they thought it was enough to just have a dark and gritty tone. But they forgot one crucial part of this equation, that being they are not Christopher Nolan. And he brought a level of sophistication to these projects that would be very hard to match. He treated his Batman film like he would any other film he would make, with the utmost respect. That's the difference between Christopher Nolan and almost everyone else who has ever stepped into this genre.
That makes sense.
And WB clearly knew what they had at one point, as they turned to Christopher Nolan to be the producer of their upcoming Superman reboot, which would basically kickstart what would become the DCEU. And who did the great Christopher Nolan select to direct this project? None other than Zack Snyder. In fact, to this day, Christopher Nolan regularly praises Zack's vision of this character. And it was in fact one of the biggest reasons why he chose him for the job in the first place. Now this bullshit article would have you believe that Man of Steel took direct inspiration from the Dark Knight trilogy, and that serious tone didn't mesh well with the more fantastical elements of a Superman story. For some reason, people took issue with Superman being treated as an actual dramatic character. They said that his characterization and the tone of the film didn't match what they know of Superman.
Bullshit.
And now Screen Rant is suggesting that this was all due to the influence of Christopher Nolan. From a pure critical standpoint, I do not see a comparison to be made between the Dark Knight trilogy and Man of Steel, other than, again, both franchises taking the character seriously. They treated the two most iconic superheroes we have with respect, instead of treating them like a punchline. Now you could say that you don't care for some of the creative decisions made in Man of Steel. I would be able to buy that. But when you try to dismiss Man of Steel as a whole, or the character of Superman in that film, as being hopeless, dreary, devoid of emotion, and not resembling Superman in any way, that's where I have a problem. And that's what tells me you might be following online narratives being written about this film instead of actually seeing it for what it is. For better or worse, Man of Steel is Zack Snyder's interpretation of Superman, not Christopher Nolan's. It's Nolan approved, but it was definitely Zack's vision. And here's the thing I don't understand about this whole argument, because reinterpreting these characters is something that's been going on since their existence in the comics. Many creatives have taken certain liberties with these characters in the past, and in effect they created some of the best stories that surrounded them. Just because it's not 100% consistent with how some people view the character does not mean that it's bad.
Only a Sith deals in absolutes.
And to be clear, I'm not even 100% on board with every creative decision made in Man of Steel. But what I do admire about it, and why I think it's criminally underrated at this point, is that it makes the character of Superman more human and more relatable than maybe he's ever been on film. I think some people have it in their heads that Superman is just some big guy in tights who flies around and punches bad guys. But to me, he is so much more than that. And Man of Steel is a movie that made him a much more complex character, complete with emotions, flaws, doubts, and insecurities.
I'm in a glass case of emotion!
And I always looked at Man of Steel as the beginning of his arc, because that's exactly what it was supposed to be. This was not intended to be Superman in his final form. It's just that some people got a little bit impatient. To me, it was Superman struggling to find his place in this world that is foreign to him, and that is a very relatable idea. Not to mention, if you don't feel something, some level of hope or emotion during Clark's scenes with his parents, or even when Superman takes flight for the first time, then I would question whether or not you have a pulse. But I get it, it's easier to dismiss Man of Steel as dark and dreary and a Dark Knight clone rather than using your brains. It amazes me that people who are paid to write articles and think pieces for these major corporations are actually incapable of thinking themselves. If Man of Steel was such a mess and irrelevant and ruined the character of Superman, why is it that people are still talking about it to this day? Or better yet, why is it that more and more people are starting to come around to the idea that this film was actually very good? Especially after you got the clearer view of the entire vision once Zack Snyder's Justice League was released. Bottom line, WB ruined the DCEU. Not Zack Snyder, not Christopher Nolan, and not any fandom. It was all WB's fault for not committing to a vision that Christopher Nolan himself co-signed. The truth is that this whole universe didn't go off the rails until WB foolishly tried to course correct, and in effect started to take these characters less and less seriously.
Go f*** another fish, asshole!
Y'all be cool. Shut up.